Request the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
In a few hours, this chamber will have the opportunity to restore benefits for 1.7 million American job seekers and help reduce the national deficit by $1.2 billion. I believe my colleagues understand that this is a fiscally responsible way to help job seekers who are still struggling in the aftermath of the Great Recession. UI helps people to look for work, while at the same time bolstering consumer demand and supporting the economy, which is why the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office has estimated that renewing unemployment insurance for 1 year will save 200,000 jobs. This is an imperative. We must do this on behalf of the families who are struggling, on behalf of our economy that needs the support. This is something that must be done. Now the question is whether we can move this critical bill forward and send help to those who are struggling through no fault of their own. Everyone understands that to qualify for unemployment insurance, you have to be working and you have to lose your job through no fault of your own, and that you have to continue to search for work. And the reality in this market is that there are, in many cases, 3 applicants for every job. And we've all heard the stories when we've gone home to our states. The software engineer who's worked for 20 years, who's put out 300 resumes, who's followed people around to give them resumes. I heard the story of an individual who was so persistent to try to get a job in the financial services that he would show up early in the morning and put his resume in the local newspaper for the head of the bank he was interviewing with. And that eventually got him a call back, I'm told, but not yet a job. It's very difficult. And we can do what we've always done, is help these struggling Americans and help our economy. At every point in this process, I believe we have responded to the issues raised by our colleagues to try to get this done. Instead of a full year of extended unemployment benefits, which I propose, which we typically do, we compromised on a short-term extension in order just to get it done. Just to get it done, because since December 28th, people have lost their benefits. They went off a cliff. Every week, 60,000 more Americans lose their benefit. It's up to 1.7 million now. It'll be several million before this year is run out. And so instead of a typical 1-year extension, we're asking for 3 months. Most of it now, or a large part of it, being retroactive to make up to those people who lost their benefits beginning on December 28th. And I was joined, and I must thank him for his tremendous leadership, by Senator Dean Heller of Nevada. This is a bipartisan effort. It's a bipartisan effort because this unemployment, particularly this long-term unemployment problem, knows no political dimension or geographic dimension or ethnic or gender dimension. It is an American problem, and we're responding on a bipartisan way, Senator Hill and I. And we put what we thought was a pathway to provide immediate aid to these job seekers and give us enough time to work through these complex issues that many of my colleagues have raised. Issues about, well, can we make the program overall more effective? Can we incentivize individuals to seek more employment more efficiently? Can we integrate training? All of those are important issues, but in the context of a 3-month emergency extension, the first thing to do is get the relief to the people and then to sit down conscientiously and deliberately and work on the details. When this concession wasn't enough to break a filibuster, Democrats put forth another proposal, again, after consultation with our Republican colleagues. And I thank Senator Heller, but Senator Collins, Senator Portman, Senator Coates, many others, who consciously and conscientiously provided thoughts, provided input, et cetera. This was not a my way or the highway. This was trying to find a bipartisan pathway, and we're still searching. So, based on those comments, we now propose a fully paid-for extension of unemployment insurance. Then we started off with 11.5 months fully paid for. We used a pay-for that would have been an extension of the mandatory savings agreed to in the bipartisan budget agreement, which had been endorsed by House Budget Chairman Congressman Paul Ryan. And we also included in that proposal, the long-term proposal, a major policy change proposed by Senator Portman addressing overlapping unemployment and disability insurance payments. None of these changes were very easy for us to accept on our side. The tradition or the routine has to be unpaid for unemployment extension. Very few times have we paid for these because they're considered emergency spending. This is an emergency. People are struggling out there. But we accepted the premise, which our Republican colleagues suggested, has to be paid for. Then we accepted the premise also that we couldn't pay for it by tax revenues. It would have to be paid for by something else. And so we took a proposal that was embedded in the budget, and we tried to use that together with a proposal that was first presented by Senator Portman. But we had a vote on this, another cloture vote, and none of our Republican colleagues supported it. Well, then we had a vote on the underlying measure, again, the short-term extension, the 3-month extension unpaid for by Senator Heller and I, and Senator Heller joined us on that vote, and I thank him for that. But still not the significant number of Republican colleagues necessary not only to move this measure forward, but also to do the right thing. And we're here today, Mr. President. We've had another round of extensive discussions and consultations, and we're now about to pay for a 3-month extension of the unemployment benefits, some of it retroactive, which is fully paid for. And I will point out, it is February. This extension will go forward until March. We're reaching the point, ironically, where we might have more retroactive payments than prospective payments. That's why, again, we have to move, and we have to move today. It's not everything we wanted, certainly. I mean, we would have, as I said initially, we would have preferred a full year, give people certainty for the year. We would have, as we've done more times than not, declared emergency spending. But in order to conscientiously and thoughtfully and cooperatively and collaboratively work with our colleagues, we have continually sort of agreed to make concessions. That, I used to think, was the nature of political compromise, principled political compromise. And we've tried. So now we have a 3-month bill. It's paid for by a technique called pension smoothing, which we have enacted on a bipartisan basis. In fact, the vote was 79 to 19 in the 2012 transportation bill, MAP 21. So this is not a controversial pay for. This is something that we have embraced before. It is something that does not involve revenues, which is one of the benchmarks that our colleagues laid down. So we have a short-term, fully paid-for UI benefit that can go out immediately to people who are suffering, that is paid for by a non-controversial mechanism. And essentially, it will do what I think we have been requested to do by our colleagues on this side. Now our request is simply support us in this effort so that we can get this legislation accomplished. One of the interesting things about this pay for is not only was it in the transportation bill, and it's due to expire and we'll extend it, but also it's been used on numerous occasions by colleagues on both sides of the aisle to pay for a various assembly of different legislative proposals. So this is not a controversial mechanism. I don't think UI is controversial. I think people hopefully recognize that it's necessary in this situation. We've also included a provision in this proposal that has been championed aggressively and thoughtfully by Senator Coburn that will bar individuals with income over $1 million from receiving the federal unemployment insurance benefits. It's passed this House, I believe, this Assembly, this chamber, by a vote of 100 to 1, I think, when it was brought up. That's my recollection, but I will defer to the record. And then the other factor, which I would argue to my colleagues, is as we try to pay for this extension, we're also able to accrue $1.2 billion over 10 years to reduce the deficit. So if my colleagues are looking for proposals that are fully paid for, reduce the deficit, and provide needed assistance to Americans who have worked and are looking for work and desperately want a job, we need their vote this afternoon. So I hope we can move forward on this bill. Help unemployed Americans who are searching for work. Help employers, because this pension smoothing mechanism helps employers, and also reduce the deficit. That's a pretty good trifecta, something I think we should support. And the other point I want to make at this point is that the notion that unemployment insurance, federal long-term benefits, should be a political issue is, I think, in stark contrast to the history. Congress has renewed UI on a bipartisan basis in the past on numerous occasions. We did it 3 times under President Ronald Reagan. We did it 5 times under President George W. Bush. So I think that's the precedent to get it done today. That's pretty good precedent on a bipartisan basis under 2 Republican presidents. But one of the questions comes up, and it really does the Republican leadership, not some of the members who we've collaborated with very closely, but do they want this to pass? Or will they say, no, it's forget the substance. It's so compelling. Let's talk about process.
Will be vitiated.
Without objection.
Madam President, I know we are shortly going to be voting, among other issues, on the nomination of Max Baucus to be the next United States ambassador to China. And I would expect that he would have a unanimous, if not near unanimous, vote of the Senate. As I said in the Foreign Relations Committee this week, clearly one of the biggest challenges, the biggest opportunities before U.S. foreign policy today is getting the relationship between the United States and China in the context of our rebalance to the Asia-Pacific right. And I can think of few more able or more qualified at this important moment in history than our friend and colleague, the senator from Montana, to help provide advice and guidance to the President and to Congress about how to get that relationship right. He's an expert on trade issues. He understands what we face in the coming years as China economies continues to grow. He's fully aware of the facts that we have had U.S. exports to China that have increased by almost $40 billion in the past 4 years alone, creating and sustaining millions of U.S. jobs in sectors across the board: automobiles, power generation, machinery, aircraft, other vital industrial sectors. His trade missions to China, since he's been the chairman of the Finance Committee, have given the perspective he needs to deal with the realities of our policy options. And I think from the hearing he clearly understands through the rest of the 21st century and beyond, much of the strategic, political, and economic future of the world is likely to be shaped by the decisions made in Washington and Beijing and the capitals of Asia over the next 4 to 5 years. And how we get that rebalance right is incredibly important, and who the ambassador to China is incredibly important in that regard. Finally, trade is not the only issue as it relates to China. Our collective security, having China pursue a rules-based system, incredibly important, what happens in the South China Sea. All those issues Senator Baucus addressed in his nomination hearing with, I think, great ability and insight and a willingness to take them on. And the very final thing is human rights is an incredibly important issue as it relates to China. And I just want to read briefly from the transcript where he was asked about the question of human rights. And he described a moment as a senator in which he raised with then-President Jiang Zemin and raised with him the question of a dissident in Tibet. And he said that the President of China said, "I don't know what you're talking about." But then Senator Baucus went to Tibet, went to Lhasa, and raised the same point there. And sure enough, within about 2 or 3 weeks, that dissident was released. Protection of human rights, he said, is the bedrock. It is the underpinning of American and world society. People look to America to lead on so many issues, including the protection of human rights, religious freedoms, freedom of the press, all the rights that are enumerated in the Universal Declaration. It is what most progress springs from. And the answer is yes to Senator Cardin, who asked the question, you have my commitment on human rights. I think the totality of trade, currency manipulation, security, and human rights, the answers that he gave in his hearing clearly show manifestly that he is very capable to be the next ambassador, and I urge his unanimous vote from the Senate, and I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
First, let me add my accolades to those of the Chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee with respect to Senator Baucus. He is superbly prepared to be our next ambassador to China. He is a friend, a colleague. The President has chosen wisely, and I anticipate his confirmation. But in a few minutes, Madam President, we will have the opportunity to provide relief to 1.74 million job seekers, to help local businesses, to get people back to work, and to do so in a fiscally responsible manner. And some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have thoughtfully engaged with us to find a path forward. Many of their ideas are incorporated into this principled compromise. It's been 40 days since these Americans have had their unemployment insurance cut. Now is the time to act and help our economy grow. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of providing aid to 1.7 million Americans, growing each week by 60,000. This is the right thing to do. At this moment, this is the right way to do it. And the only question before this Senate is, will we do the right thing for the American people? With that, Madam President, I would yield the floor.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Madam President, I would ask unanimous consent to yield back all remaining time.
Without objection. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the Reed of Rhode Island Amendment number 2714 to S. 1845, a bill to provide for the extension of certain unemployment benefits and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on amendment number 2714 to S. 1845, a bill to provide for the extension of certain unemployment benefits and for other purposes, shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reid of Rhode Island. Mr. Reid of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Baucus, Heitkamp, Hirono, Markey, Menendez, and Reed of Rhode Island. Senators voting in the negative: Lee and Wicker. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Paul. No. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johans, no. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, no. Mrs. Hagan. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Vitter, no. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, aye. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller, aye. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Isaacson, no. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Coburn, no. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, no. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions, no. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain, no. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson, aye. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, no. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, aye. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Hoven, no. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Barrasso, oh. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Alexander, no. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Corker. Mr. Corker, no. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, no. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coates, no. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi, no. Mr. Kirk. Mr. Kirk, no. Mr. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Franken. Mr. Franken, aye. Mr. Begich. Mr. Begich, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, aye. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, no. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss, no. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Donnelly, aye. Mr. Reid of Rhode Island. Mr. Reid of Nevada, aye. Sir. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no.
Michael.
Mr. Flake, no. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Rubio, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Nevada, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 58, the nays are 40. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn have not voted in the affirmative, and the motion is not agreed to. Majority Leader?
Yes, I enter a motion to revote. I enter a motion to reconsider the vote by which cloture was not invoked on the Reed of Rhode Island amendment.
The motion is entered.
Madam President, for the benefit of all members, we're going to have another vote right now on the other cloture vote that's been scheduled. Then the Republican leader said that we can move forward on the Baucus nomination at that time.
Next two votes will be 10 minutes long.
Next two votes, I ask consent they be 10 minutes in duration.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on S. 1845, a bill to provide for the extension of certain unemployment benefits and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on S. 1845, a bill to provide for the extension of certain unemployment benefits and for other purposes, shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Thank you. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Begich, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Coons, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Heller, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Manchin, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Reed of Rhode Island, Sanders, Schatz, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Warner, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Franken. Mr. Franken, aye. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Cornyn, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Blake, Graham, Grassley, Hoeven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johann, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kirk, Lee, McConnell, Murkowski, Hall, Portman, Risch, Rubio, Shelby, Toomey, Vitter, and Wicker. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Thune, no. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Corker, no. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. McCain, no. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Sessions, no. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Nevada? Aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of New Mexico? Aye. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren? Aye. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo? No. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Nevada? No.
On this vote, the yeas are 55, the nays are 43. 3/5 of the Senate duly chosen and sworn have not voted in the affirmative, and the motion is not agreed to. The Majority Leader.
I have a motion to reconsider cloture was not invoked in S. 1845.
The motion is entered. Motion is entered. Motion to reconsider. Motion is entered.
The motion is entered.